Hi guys, you're welcome to the channel. My name is Victoria and in today's video we'll be making a drawstring dress. So I've already laid out the tools that I'll be needing for this tutorial, and I'll be using this vibrant crepe fabric for this project. I have 2 yards here, and without further ado, let's get started. So first I'll begin by drafting out the pattern for this dress, and to do that I'll start by drawing a horizontal line from the top edge of my pattern paper, and I'll be taking all my vertical measurements from that line. So I'll begin by marking my shoulder to bust measurement at 11 inches. Then I'll be marking my half length at 17 inches before going in with my ruler to square out these points. Now I'm just indicating my bust line, and the half length will become my waistline. Next, I'll be creating my neckline and shoulder slope. And to do that, I'll be marking half of my shoulder measurement at 8 inches from the center front. And then I'll be going down by 1 inch from that point. Now I'm going to go ahead and create my neckline, and for the width I'll be using 4 inches. You can use 3.5 as well, it's up to you. For the neck depth I'll be using 3.5 inches. So now I'm going in with my French curve to connect the 2 points together in order to create the neckline. And then I'm going to go in with my ruler and connect the point below the shoulder measurement to the neckline to form the shoulder slope. And from the end of that slanted line, I'll be marking my upper chest line at 8 inches. So I'm just going in with my ruler to square that point out before indicating what it stands for. So now it's time to create the armhole. And to do that, I'm going to start by connecting the shoulder slope to the upper chest line in a straight line. And then I'm going to determine the midpoint of that line, and from that point I'll be going in by 3/4 of an inch. The next thing I'm going to do is to mark 1/4 of my bust circumference on the upper chest line before connecting the 3 points together to create the front armhole. So now that that's done, it's time to create the dart, and to do that I'll be marking my bust pan measurement divided by 2 on the waistline and on the bust line. And then on the waistline I'll be marking half an inch on both sides of that point, and on the bust line I'll be going down by 1 inch before connecting all these points together to create the dart. So now that I'm done creating the dart, it's time to insert 1/4 of my horizontal measurements. I already marked my bust circumference divided by 4 on the upper chest line, so I just did the same on the bust line, and on the waistline I'll be marking my waist circumference divided by 4. And to that measurement I'll be adding 1 inch from the dart before going ahead to add my seam allowance. And for the seam allowance I'll be using 1 inch. So I'll be marking 1 inch on the upper chest line, the bust line and the waistline. And when I'm all done with that, I'm going to connect my waistline to the upper chest line with my ruler. So now I'm going to be adding half an inch allowance along the waistline that I'll use to join to the lower part of this dress. And I'm also going to be adding 1/2 inch seam allowance along the shoulder slope. So guys, that's it for the front pattern. I'm just indicating my center front and that this pattern will be cut on a fold before going ahead to cut out the pattern. Now I'll be using the front pattern to create the back because they are basically the same except for the armhole, the neckline and the dart. There's also going to be a zipper on this dress, and for that I marked 1.5 inch for the zip. So for this back pattern I'll be working on the neckline, the armhole and the dart. For the neckline I'll be using 4 inches for the width and 1.5 inches for the depth. Again, I'm going in with my French curve to connect the 2 points together to create the back neckline. Next, I'm going to work on the back armhole, so I'm marking 1/4 of my bust circumference on the upper chest line like I did for the front before creating the back armhole. And now for the dart, I'll be marking 1/2 of my bust span measurement on the upper chest line, the bust line and the waistline before connecting these points with my ruler. And then from the upper chest line, I'll be going down by 1 inch along that vertical line, and on the waistline I'll be marking 1/2 inch on both sides of the line before connecting the 3 points with my ruler. And that's it for the back pattern. So now I'm just connecting the half length to the zipper allowance before cutting it out. So now that I'm done with the top part of this dress, it's time to work on the bottom part. So again, I'm going in with my ruler to draw a horizontal line from the top edge of my pattern paper, and I'll be taking my vertical measurements from that line. So I'm just going to call that line the waistline before going ahead to start inserting my vertical measurements. So I'll be starting with my hip line at 8.5 inches. I'm just going with my ruler to square out that point. And now it's time to mark the full length of the dress, and I'll be using 45 inches as the length of this dress. Remember, I already have 17 inches for the top part of the dress, so I'll be taking note of that when marking the full length. So I'm just going with my ruler to square out that point as well. And now it's time to start inserting my horizontal measurements, and I'll begin by marking 1/4 of my waist circumference on the waistline. And to that measurement, I'll be adding 1 inch for seam allowance. There isn't going to be a dart on the bottom part of this dress, so 1 inch for seam allowance is fine. Now on the hip line, I'll also be marking 1/4 of my hip measurement plus 1 inch for seam allowance. And on the hemline, I'll be marking my hip circumference divided by 4 plus 2 inches and then 1 inch for seam allowance. And then I'm going to be connecting these 3 points together. So I'm connecting the waistline to the hip line and the hip line to the hemline. So now I'm just going in with my French curve to smoothen out that sharp edge along the hip line. And then I'll be adding seam allowance along the hemline and the waistline. For the hemline, I'm using 1 inch seam allowance. And for the waist, I'll be using 1/2 inch to join this bottom part to the top. And that's it for the bottom part of this dress, guys. So I'll be using this same pattern to cut out the front and the back. Only the front will be on a fold, and I'll be cutting 2 pieces for the back plus the zipper allowance. So I've gone ahead to cut out the front exactly as the pattern, and for the back, instead of cutting on a fold, I'll be cutting out 2 pieces. As you can see, I already give out allowance for my zipper. I've also gone ahead to cut out the top parts of the dress as well. I have 2 pieces for the back and 1 piece for the front. So I cut out my sleeve pattern off camera because I already have a detailed tutorial on how to draft a basic sleeve pattern. I simply extended the length of the sleeve because the full length I'll be using for this sleeve is 23 inches plus 1 inch seam allowance, that's 24 in total. And then I marked 2 times my wrist circumference because there's going to be elastic on the wrist. So my wrist is 7.5 times 2, that's 15 inches plus half an inch seam allowance. So using this pattern, I cut out 2 pieces, 1 for each arm. So now it's time to start stitching the pieces together, and I'm starting with the top part of the dress. So here I have the front piece, and I already cut out facing that I'll be using to finish off the neckline. You can use a bias as well if you don't have enough fabric. So what I'm going to do now is to place the facing onto the fabric, right sides facing each other like so. And then I'm going to pin along the neckline before taking it over to the machine and stitching around that area. After which I'm going to be making a top stitch on the facing fabric. And I'll be doing the same for the back pieces as well. So guys, I finished off the neckline for both the front and back pieces. I've also gone ahead to sew in the darts of the front piece and the back piece. And now I'm going to be joining the front and back pieces together along the shoulder. So I'm placing the back piece to the front, right sides facing each other, matching fabric to fabric and facing to facing before pinning it down. And I'll be doing the same to the other shoulder before taking it over to the machine and sewing on a half-inch seam allowance. So after stitching, this is what it looks like, and now it's time to work on the bottom part of the dress. So this is the front piece of the bottom part, and the first thing I did was mark half of my bust band measurement all the way down from the center front. So I marked 4 inches from the center front all the way from the waist to the hemline. This is where the drawstring is going to sit. And for the casing of the drawstring, I cut out a rectangular strap that is 3 inches wide and 1 inch shorter than the length of the skirt. And I'm going to be folding in both sides of the strap like so before placing it on that line and sewing it all the way down. So I'll be making 3 stitches on this strap, 1 in the middle and 1 on each side. So after stitching, this is what it looks like on the wrong side, and this is what it looks like on the right side. As you can see, the casing did not reach the hemline, so I can finish off the hemline by folding it inwards and sewing along that area. So now I'll be creating the straps that will be passed through the casing. So here I have 2 rectangular pieces, 1.5 inches wide and about 45 inches long. You can make yours as long or as short as you want. So I'm going to be folding the straps in 2 like so. This should be done on the wrong side, please. And then I'm going to be stitching about half an inch away from the raw edge before turning it inside out. So I'm done stitching the straps. Like I said, I stitched on the wrong side of the fabric. So now I'm going to be trimming off the excess allowance before turning it inside out. And after doing that, this is what it looks like. So all that's left to do now is to pass these straps through the casing. And I'll be using my safety pin to pass each of the straps into the casing. So after passing in the straps, this is what it looks like. And I'll be holding the straps in place by making a small stitch on the casing along the waistline before attaching the bottom pieces to the top. So I'll be placing the bottom pieces to the top pieces, right sides facing each other. I'll pin it down before taking it to the machine and stitching them together. Okay, so now I'm done joining the top piece to the bottom pieces. Now I'll be attaching the sleeve to the armhole. So right now I'll be placing the sleeve to the fabric, right sides facing each other, matching the center notch to the shoulder seam, pinning it down and sewing along the armhole, and I'll be doing the same for the other side as well. So I'm done attaching the sleeves. Right now I'll be turning the fabric over to the wrong side and I'll be sewing from the sleeve all the way down to the hemline of the dress. So guys, I'm done with that. I also went ahead to stitch together the back piece, as you can see, leaving room for the zipper. So now I'm going to be hemming the bottom before attaching the elastic to the sleeve. So I'll be cutting the elastic 1 inch shorter than my wrist measurement. My wrist measurement is 7.5, so I'll be cutting 6.5 plus ½ inch for seam allowance, that's 7, and I'll be cutting out 2 pieces for each wrist. I'll be folding in the end of the sleeve like so to create a casing for the elastic. So I stitched it down and left a little opening so my elastic can pass through. After passing the elastic through the sleeves, all that's left to do is to attach the zipper, and that will be all for this dress. So guys, we've come to the end of this tutorial. I hope you found it helpful. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, suggestions or ideas, feel free to leave it in the comment section. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in my next video.